Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Libya has gone completely to hell, and there's no timetable for a return journey. There may not be one at all. David Cameron, William Hague, and the other fools who govern our affairs bombed the hell out of Libya, of course, in order to save it. But by any reasoning outside of the lunatic asylum, the NATO war has resulted in an unmitigated disaster, arguably even greater than the disaster we unleashed in Iraq.
If only because Libya is a lot closer to here, a Mediterranean country, only a short sail from the European mainland.
As if things weren't bad enough in Libya, to the alphabet soup of warring factions tearing the country apart, we must now add the dreaded ISIS.
Last week, they lined up 21 Christians on the beach facing Europe and cut off their head one by one.
Of course, they were Egyptian Christians, Copts, whose blood for the West and especially its media was, well, less valuable thereby. But the atrocity has triggered some events which may prove momentous. Joining us now is Hafsa Kara Mustapha, who, despite her years, is a very considerable expert on the Arab-Maghreb. Thanks very much, Hafsa, for coming back on the show. The last time you were here, Libya was in a mess. It's arguably now finished as a state.
It's absolutely a failed state. There is no longer any Libya to speak of, to be honest. It's fractured, it's war-torn, and it's now the new playground for ISIS murderers.
We'll come back to ISIS in a minute. There was already a real existential crisis before ISIS emerged on the scene. The country is effectively in three parts, maybe more. Warring militias have set up rival governments. One controls the airport, so you can't get into the country unless you go through them. A different set of people is in Benghazi, pretending to be the government in Tripoli, pretending to be the government. Who is the government? Is there any government?
There is no government. There are a few people claiming that they're somehow ruling the show, but no one really is. It's a lawless country, and it's completely left to its own devices, and we're seeing the results day in, day out. It's a situation that is deteriorating as we speak. And, of course, all this was obviously predictable, given that it was bombed into democracy. And as we've seen before and was discussed before, when you bomb a country into democracy, this is the result you get.
The idea was to get rid of the Gaddafi regime, even though that regime was cooperating very profitably indeed with the West, relations with Sarkozy, relations with Tony Blair, and so on. For some reason, they decided Gaddafi had to go, and go he did. Nobody seems to have known that the result would be exactly as Gaddafi predicted. I remember them laughing when he said that the uprising in Benghazi was Al-Qaeda. They laughed out loud on the television at this idea. And yet, that's where we now are. ISIS, an Al-Qaeda breakaway, rejected by Al-Qaeda as too extreme, too sectarian, too fanatic, even for Osama bin Laden's outfit. Where are they? What are they doing? And are they going to grow stronger?
They're very likely to grow stronger because, of course, they operate in areas where there is no resistance to their expansion. And, of course, we know that the country was flooded with arms at the time of the NATO onslaught. So now there are arms everywhere. There's a youthful population in Libya doing nothing and actually armed to the teeth. There are faction wars and struggles between the various parties. So I think it's a perfect ground. It's the ideal fertile ground for ISIS expansion, even better than Syria and Iraq, because, of course, these countries still have some sort of, well, they have a stable government and they have armies resisting ISIS expansion. Libya doesn't. And so, therefore, ISIS has found its perfect place to actually develop and spread across the Sahel.
The reason that the Taliban came to power in Afghanistan was exactly this scenario. The country was broken into pieces. Rival gangs were murdering each other. The Taliban came along and said, we are a gang, but we are the strongest gang, and we have a plan. And they eventually subjugated all the other warring parties, or at least drove them out, and came to power. Is there a real chance that on the Mediterranean, ISIS might actually achieve power in Libya?
Well, for one thing, comparing them to the Taliban is actually, the Taliban are much nicer than ISIS. ISIS were very opposed to women's rights and all the rest of it, but they didn't actually line up 21 Christians and beheaded them in front of the cameras. There are a lot of things that the Taliban actually never dared doing. So even the comparison is actually, is perhaps...
Unbelievable,
Absolutely.
They blew up statues of the Buddhas, but they didn't cut people's heads off and film it.
And in such, glorified way. So I think the Taliban almost appear now as the nice guys in comparison to ISIS. And of course, I believe that now ISIS, facing no resistance, there is absolutely no reason why they wouldn't expand. The problem now is actually to at least contain them within Libya, and that's probably going to be the challenge for the other countries.
That's what I was just about to ask. What about the neighboring countries of Libya?
Well,
Are they affected by this?
Of course, they're all very scared to see an ISIS expansion within their borders. So we know already that Egypt has intervened and they bombed some areas, some ISIS strongholds. We know that Tunisia and Algeria are working together in order to sort of at least secure both the borders of Tunisia and Algeria in ensuring that ISIS doesn't move into that very wide desert area that is very difficult to actually monitor.
Is there an actual border?
Well, no, it's the Sahara Desert. It's
Exactly.
very, very difficult to secure. You obviously, with the Algerian government, it's an oil-rich country and therefore has good equipment to monitor, to fly above the area and actually secure it, more or less attempt to secure it. So I think there is some effort in that part of the region. However, it remains a very, very difficult area to police, definitely.
Another difference between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS is that the Taliban were local. They wanted to rule only Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda and ISIS have not just a pan-Arabic ambition, but when they lined these people up on the beach to cut their heads off, they were pointing at Europe and saying, we're headed your way. Libya is very, very close to Europe. And that's perhaps concentrating the mind of politicians who helped ISIS and Al-Qaeda grow into the power that they are in the first place, either advertently or inadvertently. How realistic is it that Libya will become a bridgehead for this kind of extremism into Europe in a big way?
I think that's sort of almost a scaremongering technique. They've been really trying to poke the West for a while with the beheadings of the 2 Western journalists. But obviously, I think their ambition remains the Arab world. I think it's the easier thing to do. Crossing the Mediterranean, tackling major armies, major Western armies, is a completely different issue. And I think while they're trying to work on that sort of scaremongering thing, I think their ambition now is to expand within Africa, the Sahel belt, which is obviously very badly secured, where there are areas that are facing tribal issues. So they're probably going to go for the easy option, which is to spread across Sahel and then unite with Boko Haram, which is in Nigeria.
Which has already declared itself a part of this caliphate,
Absolutely.
this bogus self-appointed caliphate based in Iraq, Syria. But now the state of Borno in the north of Nigeria has declared itself to be a part of this worldwide empire. One of the obvious points is that these people are thriving in the absence of anybody else with a plan. There's a failure of Arab nationalism, there's a failure of socialism, and Islamism of this particularly virulent brand looks like the only show in town.
Well, one of the reasons why these failures in the Arab world came about was very much because the Arab Spring, the original Arab Spring, was hijacked. You know, there were the movements that triggered the Arab Spring were very legitimate. These were people who were requesting more freedoms. They wanted to rid their governments of corruption, of cronyism. So these were very legitimate claims by all Arabs who took to the streets in 2011. But of course, with the NATO intervention, with the threat, with the destruction of Syria through proxy movements funded by the Saudis, funded by Western governments, we've seen the collapse, more or less the collapse of Syria. We see that Iraq is a basket case as a result of the 2003 invasion, and Libya as well. You know, these were major points that kept the sort of pan-Arabist movement together. Now, with the collapse of this, of course, what will fill the void? The only void that can be filled is obviously these movements that are coming in with a message, well, we're Muslim, we're all under the banner of Islam, we can work together. And to many people, that message is actually appealing. In the absence of a credible alternative, their message is actually very attractive.
Now, General Sisi, who's killed a fair number of Egyptians himself, was sufficiently outraged at the killing of 21 Egyptians in Libya to bomb the country. kind of had a right to, don't you think?
It's difficult to say, I think, as you say, for somebody who showed no remorse in gunning down 1,400 unarmed protesters. I think this is a bit of a show for his domestic audience as opposed to really trying to tackle ISIS. I think to a certain extent, for Sisi, having the Islamist bogeyman is very good for his standing in Egypt because it allows him to continue to crack down on the Muslim Brotherhood, on any form of dissent by saying, well, look, if I'm not this firm, these are the guys that you're going to get in Egypt. So I think it's more of a show than actually a genuine desire to intervene and stop the spread of ISIS.
In the last days, eminent people, some of them fools, but eminent nonetheless, have begun to raise the spectre of a NATO ground invasion of Libya. I would have thought that very unwise myself. Do you think they're going to do it? And if they did, what would be the result?
If they did, the result would be a bad situation turned worse. I think there is no secret about that. We know for a fact, and if we look at it objectively and we observe the map of the Arab world, we can see that every Western intervention has turned a bad situation worse. So I can't imagine anything worse than another NATO intervention in Libya. Now, are they going to do it? I think that there is a desire to appeal to Western audiences and say that something is being done. I think that seeing planes, warplanes, pounding an Arab country is the thing that is going to be fed to audiences. But is it going to solve any problem? I don't think it will, no.
No, bombing cannot end this problem. Indeed, as you say, may well be making it worse. But something has to be done. What is it?
And that's a very difficult question because who do you speak to? Who are ISIS? How many people are part of ISIS? It's very, very difficult to say. We've heard that in less than a year, they went from being a group of 500 to some are saying 10,000, 20,000. We actually don't even have an accurate figure of how many ISIS fighters there are. Who are they? Who is the central command? We have heard of one figure, which is al-Baghdadi, and then we don't know anything about the rest. So it's really very difficult to tackle some sort of bizarre organization that seems a death cult that seems to spread everywhere, that has absolutely no remorse in spreading death and killings everywhere, but of course is not interested in any form of negotiation or dialogue. No. So how do you deal with it? I'm afraid I don't know.
Hafsa? If you don't know, nobody knows. And that's indeed the problem.
Coming up after the break, Reading the World with Anne Morgan. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Anne Morgan set out to read every book in the world. Well, not quite every book, but a book from every country. It's safe to say, at least in this country, she's definitely the only person who's ever done that.
Her own book about the books she read is called Reading the World, and from where better to view the world and its literature than on board the Sputnik.
Anne Morgan, welcome. It is a quite beautiful book.
Thank you very much.
To look at and to read. You went around the world in 80 days, not quite 80 days, and you didn't go around the world. You read them all from here. What
That's
a
right.
wonderful idea. How did it come to you?
Thank you. Well, it came about because of a chance comment that someone made to me that made me look at my bookshelves. And I'd always thought of myself as a very cultured, cosmopolitan sort of person. But when I looked at my bookshelves, they told a rather different story. In fact, pretty much all the books on there were by British or American authors, and there was nothing in translation. And I just thought, why on earth is that? That's very strange. Why would I limit myself to such a narrow tranche of what the world has to offer? And the next year, 2012, was going to be a very international year for the UK, what with the Olympics and the Queen's Jubilee. So I thought, well, why don't I use this as an opportunity to go out and meet the world through books?
It's a wonderful idea. Obviously, no one else had ever thought of it, lucky for you. But it reminded me of a conversation I had in the mountains of Nicaragua during the first Sandinista government with one of the guerrilla leaders, Comandante Victor Tirado. He said to me, if I asked you to name the geniuses in world history, every genius you would name would be a European. And of course, he was right. British people have restricted themselves and been restricted too by our education system to the literature of Britain and North America, and not even that much of North America. Even the European great works of literature are very rarely translated and on people's shelves. Why do you think that is?
It's a tough one. I think it's partly what we've been used to, and inevitably with the British Empire going out, there's been a sort of history of exporting British culture, the British English language, which is part of it. English is such a widely spoken language around the world these days. And so there's an imbalance. For writers everywhere, there's this huge holy grail of being published in English. If, as a French writer, you're published in English, you suddenly have an incomparable reach, because English is not only the most published language, but the most translated language. So if you get a deal in English, you then have much greater chance of being translated into other languages. So there's that. And because of this imbalance, a huge number of texts going out of English and very few coming in, it's very hard for that to change. That's a very slow process. At the moment, it's only about 4.5% of poetry, drama and fiction that's published in this country that is translated.
Wow.
Yeah.
There are exceptions, although they don't travel as far as I would have thought. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, author of great works. There was a time when quite a lot of people were reading Solitude and other great works. But when he died recently, I tweeted lamentation of that death, and a really surprising number of people asked me, who's he?
Really? Gosh, that's very interesting.
Yeah, a bit depressing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell us about your findings of Reading the World.
Well, I mean, one of the things that was amazing with the project, because my reading had been so narrow, I knew that I couldn't do it on my own. I would have no idea what a good book to read from Namibia would be. So my first thing was I needed help, I needed advice. And so I launched the project with an appeal to the world's readers, just saying, could you recommend what I should read? And I had no idea whether...
online?
That's right, just online. I had no idea whether anyone would be interested at all. I might be on my own doing this crazy quest. And actually, what happened was that within hours, people were getting in touch. And first of all, it was friends, and then friends of friends, and then people who came to it, and I had no idea how they'd found it. And 4 days after I launched the project with this appeal, I had a message from a woman in Kuala Lumpur saying, I love the sound of this project. I'd like to go to my local English language bookshop and choose your Malaysian book and post it to you. Would you let me do that? And I just thought, amazing. There's this woman more than 6,000 miles away doing this really generous thing. I've got to do this project now because someone's made this effort. And time and again throughout the year, book lovers all over the planet helped, which was incredible.
Amazing.
And what were the major differences? Are there major differences? You see, I'm one of those who believes there's nothing called English culture or French culture or Namibian culture. There's only culture. Were there differences, major differences in the works that you read?
There were in some ways. Some of the works I read were from places where the written tradition actually isn't that central. So it's more about telling stories orally. And that in itself was a challenge, because how do you record those stories and present them so that someone thousands of miles away can read them? So, for example, in West Africa, there's a very strong oral storytelling tradition, and that was fascinating to read a book that had been constructed from recording one of these performances. Then there were books that came from tiny Pacific Island nations, like Kiribati, which actually featured a number of different genres. So you had stories, but also poetry woven in, and artwork, local artwork was woven in. And so the distinctions that we're used to thinking of, fiction, poetry, drama, art, they were actually much less distinct in those texts.
How many books did you read for this project?
I did, well, actually, in the end, I did 197. So I did all UN-recognised countries, which is 195, plus Taiwan, which used to be a UN member. And then as the year went on, I became conscious of all these territories that weren't represented on this list, and even more conscious of them out there. And so I decided to do an extra territory that would represent the rest of the world, and people who visited the blog chose that, and that ended up being Kurdistan.
As well, speaking about UN represented or not, did you find any political propagandas throughout this literature that you were reading?
Yes, well, perhaps the most interesting example was North Korea. I read a book from North Korea. Now, initially, I thought that I would get a story by one of the defectors. There are a number of really compelling memoirs that have been published by people who've escaped in recent decades.
Some of them later discredited.
Well, indeed, absolutely. And I thought initially maybe that's what I would do, but actually I thought, well, that's not going to tell me anything about what books are actually read and published inside North Korea, and I'd be interested to know that if I can. So I actually got in touch. There's a guy who works for the government in North Korea. He's Spanish-born, and he went there, convinced them to change the law so that he could work there, and became a North Korean citizen. And you can email him. His job is to build ties with the rest of the world. It's quite a tall order, really.
Yes.
But I
That's
emailed
not working
him.
very well.
Yeah, I emailed him, and we had a discussion. He recommended a collection of folk stories, which he claimed were all based in historic fact. And I thought, well, let's see how far I can push this, you know. So I said, well, I'm particularly interested in contemporary adult fiction, if you can recommend anything. And he came back with a really interesting reply. He said, no fiction has been published in the whole history of North Korea. There is no such thing. And I thought, well, this is strange, because I happen to know there are some short stories, some what we would call fiction, that have been published in an anthology. So I went back to him and I said, perhaps we don't mean the same thing by fiction. Maybe you understand it's something fabrication, and actually I'm talking about these stories, like by these writers. Anyway, at that point, Kim Jong-il died, and so it was a very convenient point for him to end the conversation. However, I actually ended up reading a memoir that someone else recommended to me that had been published in Pyongyang, and it was by a war correspondent who'd been imprisoned in South Korea for 30 years and then went back to the country. And, of course, I had no way of knowing what had been done to it, who had edited it, how much propaganda had been put in. But
that's
it was
true
fascinating.
that's true of every country.
Exactly.
The line between fact and fiction,
That's
even in
right.
our own government, is sometimes blurred.
Yeah.
I've only time for one more question. It's this. She, for example, is from Indonesia, which is 20,000 islands?
Yes.
20,000 islands. Now,
Amazing.
just one island, Java, has an east and a west. Of course, it has a north and a south too. But the culture in the east is very different from the west. How did you deal with that problem, that some countries are so vast that there must be entirely different cultural output in
That's
one
right.
part rather than another?
Absolutely.
Is this
Well-
subject for a second book, maybe?
Well, perhaps, yeah. Well, I think that was something I was really conscious of. A lot of people, when they heard about my project, said, oh, you must be finding the definitive book from each country. And I said, well, no, because one book can't stand for a country. I would be annoyed if someone thought they would choose the definitive British novel. So why should I say that I can do that for anywhere else? India was perhaps the toughest example of that, because, you know, a nation of 1.2 billion plus people and so many different cultures and traditions. And actually, I ended up... an Indian journalist saved me, actually, because I was really struggling with what to choose from India. And she came to the blog and she said, well, I notice all the recommendations that people have made have been for English language works, but actually, to me, that's second best. We've got 22 other official languages here, and amazing literature in those. So one of my favourite writers is a writer who writes in Malayalam, a writer called M.T. Vasudevan, and I think you should try and find a translation of something by him. So I did. But as I say, one book can't stand for a whole country.
Well, no, but your book stands for something really important.
Thank you.
It's a very, very beautiful word, reading the world. Anne Morgan, thanks very much for coming on board the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, you recall that picture of ISIS driving down in a convoy, waving their flags, you know, in a jeep.
With very special vehicles, yeah.
And Michael Mboy makes the point, serious question is ISIS sponsored by Toyota or what? Because if that's not product placement, I don't know what it is. Every picture and video comes out and there's a fleet of brand new Toyotas.
Well, there's no mystery, and I'm afraid there's no conspiracy. They stole them. They stole them from the Iraqi armed forces, which collapsed and ran away, leaving all their material behind them and their weapons and hundreds of millions of dollars in the banks. They are not short of money. They can buy anything that they want, not least from the looted banks. But they stole all the crack modern material from the Iraqi army, which had been sold at great profit to them by Western companies, and Toyota, Japanese companies, and so on. And in Syria, they simply took everything that Western countries delivered to the so-called moderate
Yeah.
opposition. As soon as it arrived, they went in with their guns and emptied the warehouses. So Toyota are not sponsoring them. Neither directly are the Western governments sponsoring them, but they are the beneficiaries of both.
And Rauda Damach says, this is democracy made in NATO.
Well, you can't make democracy in NATO, and you certainly can't drop it in a bomb. That much we ought to be clear of now.
Well, that's all that we've got for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.